The field had always been quiet in the early mornings, wrapped in a soft haze that lifted only when the sun climbed fully above the line of old oaks bordering the property. For years, the land had been a peaceful buffer between the house and the restless world beyond it, a place where the horses moved with slow confidence, their silhouettes merging with the rolling mist like ancient guardians of the soil. It had been this way long before the HOA existed, long before anyone with a clipboard and laminated badge thought they could dictate what belonged on the land and what didn't. The property was older than the entire subdivision, purchased outright, fenced legally, taxed properly, and registered as agricultural use since the day it was cleared. Yet, despite all that history, a new wave of residents, armed with self-importance and misinformed authority, believed their recently formed HOA could extend its reach far beyond the neighborhood's actual boundaries. They believed it simply because they wanted to. And like every HOA power struggle that spiraled out of control, it began with a complaint filed quietly, anonymously, and with no warning at all. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, slipped into the mailbox in an envelope bearing the HOA official logo. The tone was condescending, the wording stiff, accusing the landowner of unauthorized livestock presence visible from the subdivision walking path. It claimed that multiple residents found the horses disruptive, unsightly, and non-compliant with community aesthetics. The arrogance was almost laughable. The horses weren't on HOA land. They weren't near HOA land. They were grazing on a privately owned, legally zoned field. But HOA rarely operated on logic. They operated on ego. And this particular HOA board, led by a president notorious in the neighborhood Facebook group for picking fights over compost bins, basketball hoops, and even mailbox colors, was no exception. At first, the landowner dismissed it as a nuisance letter, the kind sent when people wanted to test boundaries. But by Thursday, 2 HOA board members stood near the old wooden fence, taking pictures of the horses as if documenting evidence for a crime scene. Their faces carried the same expression of righteous entitlement seen in viral HOA confrontation videos, the certainty that their authority was absolute. The landowner approached, expecting a civil conversation, but the board members retreated without a word, clutching their phones like shields. Something about their behavior felt off, too furtive, too deliberate, as if they were building a case for something far bigger than a typical HOA complaint. That suspicion turned into certainty 2 days later when a white pickup truck with a livestock transport rig rolled slowly down the subdivision road, stopping at the entrance nearest the field. The company logo on the truck door sent a cold rush down the landowner's spine. It was a livestock repossession and towing service, the kind used in disputes over unpaid boarding fees or abandoned animals. It made no sense. No one had requested them. No one had any authority to request them except the property owner. Yet the driver stepped out confidently, checking paperwork as if everything he was doing was lawful, expected, and already approved. Behind him, 2 HOA board members appeared again, this time smiling with the satisfaction of people who believed they had orchestrated a victory. The landowner could hardly process the sight, strangers preparing to seize horses from private land. Shock gave way quickly to fury, but fury gave way to strategy. Playing directly into their chaos would only escalate things. Instead, the landowner calmly documented everything: license plates, faces, timestamps, their attempted entry point. When the towing crew began setting up portable panels as if they were preparing to corral the horses, the situation crossed from absurd to dangerous. Horses could be injured, frightened, or worse. Their safety mattered far more than the HOA delusional sense of power. As the crew continued working, one of the HOA members smugly announced that non-compliant animals were being removed for violating community rules. But the landowner knew something the HOA clearly didn't. Attempting to seize livestock without legal authority wasn't just a violation of property rights. It was a crime, and there was only one person who needed to hear about it. The call to the sheriff's department was brief but thorough, and the dispatcher's tone shifted instantly when the nature of the situation became clear. Illegal livestock seizure, trespassing, attempted theft, the kind of case that deputies didn't ignore or delay. The HOA members, still convinced they held the power, continued giving instructions to the tow crew, completely unaware of how quickly the situation was about to turn against them. The sheriff would arrive soon, very soon, and when he did, he wouldn't be in the mood for HOA fantasies of authority. For now, the landowner stood at the edge of the field, watching the scene unravel like a storm gathering strength, knowing that the moment the sheriff's vehicle came into view, everything would change. The HOA had crossed a line far bigger than they understood, and the consequences were already on their way, sirens or no sirens. The sound of the sheriff's SUV approaching was subtle at first, just a distant hum beneath the rustling of the trees and the low, uneasy snorts of the horses who sensed tension rippling through the air. But as the vehicle drew closer, tires rolling slow and deliberate along the gravel turnout near the field's entrance, it became clear that whatever the HOA believed they had the power to do was about to collide head first with someone who carried actual authority. The livestock towing crew, still assembling the makeshift corral panels, paused in their work when they noticed the sheriff's emblem glinting on the driver's door. Their movements stilled. Even the HOA board members, so smug moments before, shifted uncomfortably, exchanging sideways glances that betrayed the first cracks in their confidence. The sheriff stepped out with the kind of calm, commanding presence that settled the entire scene in an instant. He wasn't tall in an intimidating way, nor loud or aggressive. He simply carried himself like someone who had seen every kind of nonsense a community could produce. And this situation was already sliding into the category of extraordinary nonsense. He took in the entire scene with a long, sweeping look. The horses standing alert near the far fence line, the livestock tow crew half, finished with their panel setup, the HOA members clutching their clipboards and self-printed rule sheets, and finally the landowner standing firm, documenting every detail. The sheriff's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, part disbelief, part annoyance, and part calculation as he pieced together what he was seeing. He walked first to the landowner, nodding in acknowledgement, then asked for a quick rundown of events. No theatrics, no filler, just facts, and the landowner provided them: the unauthorized arrival of the livestock towing crew, the HOA members' statements about animal removal, the lack of any court order or legal authority, the trespassing attempt, and the obvious risk to the horses. As the sheriff listened, his jaw tightened slightly, the kind of subtle reaction that revealed he already identified a legal mess before the story was even fully told. When he turned toward the towing crew, his tone remained calm but firm, and the effect was immediate. They were cooperative, not defensive, not argumentative, because they knew the boundaries of their job. They explained that they had been contacted by the HOA, told the animals were illegally kept, and assured that the HOA had jurisdiction over the property. They showed the sheriff the work order, a poorly formatted, amateurish document typed on HOA letterhead, containing no legal citations, no land descriptions, no signatures from any lawful authority, nothing but bluster wrapped in self-importance. The sheriff's eyebrow lifted ever so slightly. He had seen people misuse HOA status before, but this was on a different level. The towing crew, to their credit, seemed increasingly uncomfortable, and one even muttered that something didn't feel right the moment they arrived. They hadn't touched the horses yet. That would become important later. Then came the moment everyone had been silently bracing for. The sheriff turned to the two HOA board members. Their postures stiffened instantly, as if they were preparing to argue their way through the situation. They lifted their clipboards defensively, with the confidence of people who had relied for far too long on intimidating neighbors with selectively interpreted rules and bureaucratic jargon. They began explaining their authority, insisting that the horses violated HOA visibility guidelines, that residents complained that they had every right to remove non-compliant animals, and that the towing company was acting under their jurisdiction. Their tone was sharp, smug, almost triumphant, completely oblivious to how incorrect they were. The sheriff let them finish, not interrupting once, but once they stopped talking, the silence that followed was suffocating. It stretched long enough for the horses to shift again, restless under the rising tension. When the sheriff finally spoke, his words cut through the air with the precision of someone clarifying a mistake that should never have been made in the first place. HOA rules did not supersede property law. HOA jurisdiction applied only to the parcels legally within their boundaries. The field in question was private, exempt, and registered agricultural land, clearly mapped on county zoning documents. No HOA, even one with delusions of grandeur, could seize livestock from land they didn't own, control, or govern. Furthermore, ordering the removal of animals without legal authority wasn't simply an overreach. It bordered on criminal actions, attempted theft, fraud, false representation of authority, and endangerment of livestock. The sheriff explained this calmly, but his words struck with the impact of a sledgehammer. The HOA board members flushed with a mix of doubt, embarrassment, and growing fear. They protested weakly, insisting that their bylaws allowed them to enforce visual compliance. Across any land visible from the neighborhood trails, a claim so absurd the sheriff actually paused before responding. Then he corrected them with the clarity of someone who had spent years reminding HOA boards of their limitations. Visibility did not equal jurisdiction. Aesthetic preferences were not enforceable on property the HOA didn't own. And most importantly, no organization could override private property rights simply because they found something inconvenient to look at. The towing crew, sensing the shift, began quietly loading their unused panels back into their truck without waiting for further instruction. They wanted nothing to do with what was unfolding. One of them apologized directly to the landowner, stating they were misled by the HOA and had no intention of taking animals illegally. The sheriff nodded at their cooperation, telling them they made the right decision to stop work. The HOA, however, wasn't done embarrassing themselves. One of the board members, emboldened by years of unchecked overreach, attempted to argue that the sheriff was misunderstanding the HOA expanded authority granted by community vote. The sheriff didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply asked to see the documented authority giving them the legal right to enter private land, seize livestock, and hire a towing service. The board member offered papers, pages of bylaws, trail maintenance notes, landscaping rules, and vague visibility standards, but nothing with legal jurisdiction, nothing granting them power over the field, nothing even remotely resembling the kind of authority required for animal seizure. The sheriff handed the papers back with professional indifference, and the HOA members suddenly looked much smaller, swallowed by the weight of their own mistake. In that moment, with their authority dismantled and their plan falling apart, their bravado collapsed. The sheriff informed them that he would be filing an incident report and forwarding it to the county attorney for review. The possible charges ranged from civil violations to criminal offenses depending on the final assessment. The HOA members paled, their confidence replaced by panic. They had expected applause from the neighborhood, not legal consequences from the sheriff's department. The landowner stood quietly through it all, saying nothing, letting the sheriff handle the situation with the calm precision of someone who had mediated countless property disputes, but rarely encountered one so absurd. When the sheriff approached again, he reassured the landowner that the situation was under control and advised documenting everything further: dates, photos, videos, statements. The towing crew left quickly, relieved to escape involvement. Their truck rolled away down the pavement, leaving only the HOA members behind, silent, pale, and shaken. The sheriff then issued them a final instruction: leave the property immediately. Any future attempts to enter the field without permission would result in immediate trespassing charges. The HOA members collected their clipboards with trembling hands and walked away, each step heavy with the realization of just how badly they had overplayed their power. The sheriff remained a moment longer, watching them retreat before giving the landowner a nod of assurance. Once the sheriff's SUV pulled away, the field slowly settled again. The horses resumed grazing, the tension fading like a dissipating storm, but the landowner knew this wasn't the end. HOA rarely accepted defeat gracefully. There would be emails, accusations, attempts to rewrite history, and beyond that, the community would soon learn what their board had attempted, and the backlash would be severe. The HOA had triggered something much larger than a simple dispute. They had forced a confrontation with the law, exposed their own illegal actions, and shaken the foundation of their authority. And as the landowner stood in the field, watching the last traces of the sheriff's vehicle disappear in the distance, one thing became clear: this battle was only beginning. The aftermath of the sheriff's intervention unfolded slowly at first, like the distant rumble of a storm that had not yet reached the field. For the remainder of that day, the landowner carried on with routine chores, refilling troughs, repairing a loose section of fencing, brushing the dust from the horses' coats. But the tension of what had happened lingered in the air. The sheriff's presence had halted the illegal seizure, but the HOA retreat was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign of regrouping. Organizations driven by pride rarely retreated quietly. They retreated only long enough to rewrite the narrative in their favor. And by the next morning, the first signs of that rewriting appeared in the neighborhood's online spaces. Spaces the landowner rarely visited, but now monitored with a wary eye. The HOA president, someone who had not even been present at the scene, had posted a lengthy statement in the community group claiming that the board's attempted livestock relocation was a misunderstood safety effort. According to the fabricated version, several residents had complained that the horses were escaping frequently, creating public risk, and the HOA had intervened solely to ensure safety while awaiting county guidance. The towing company's role was conveniently described as part of an animal welfare partnership. It was an audacious rewrite of reality, crafted with the kind of inflated confidence found in people who assumed the community would believe anything if it came wrapped in official-sounding phrasing. But not everyone bought it. Comments flooded in, some residents skeptical, others outraged, and a few blindly supportive. Screenshots of the sheriff's presence began circulating. A resident walking their dog had filmed the entire confrontation from a distance, posting a grainy video showing the sheriff speaking sternly to the HOA board members while the tow crew broke down their panels. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was damning, and the HOA narrative began unraveling in real time. The landowner watched from the sidelines, careful not to engage directly. Instead, they documented everything quietly, knowing the unfolding chaos would become useful later. The HOA president, increasingly desperate to regain control of the story, issued a second message by noon, this time accusing the landowner of refusing to comply with multiple formal requests to remove hazardous animals. It was a last-ditch attempt to justify their behavior, but the tone was brutal, defensive, and transparent. The more the HOA insisted they acted legally, the more the community questioned why law enforcement had shut their operation down. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the residents who lived closest to the walking trail. They had witnessed portions of the attempted seizure themselves, watching as strangers carried corralling panels toward the fence line, watching as the HOA members gestured angrily, watching as the sheriff's SUV rolled up and changed everything. These residents, previously indifferent to HOA politics, suddenly found themselves drawn into the conflict, and unlike the board, they had no reason to lie. As the online arguments escalated, the HOA board held an emergency meeting at the clubhouse that evening. Normally, only board members attended such meetings, but this time, word spread and homeowners arrived in droves. The parking lot filled with cars. Porch lights flickered on across the subdivision as curious residents walked over, drawn by the promise of drama. The landowner did not attend. They were not part of the HOA and had no obligation to involve themselves in the chaos. But news from inside the meeting traveled quickly through text messages, overheard conversations, and the inevitable recording someone secretly posted later that night. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere descended into chaos. The HOA president attempted to open the meeting with calm authority, explaining that the board had acted within their interpretation of visibility and safety guidelines. But homeowners weren't satisfied. They wanted answers to very specific questions: who authorized the tow company, who approved the use of HOA funds to hire them, why had the board interfered with land outside their jurisdiction, why had the sheriff been involved. Voices rose, tempers flared, and the previously untouchable HOA board found itself cornered by the very people it claimed to serve. One homeowner pointed out that the HOA had raised dues recently, promising the money would be used for maintenance, not rogue operations involving livestock seizures. Another demanded copies of the work order, and when the HOA president refused, citing ongoing review, suspicion only deepened. A third homeowner stood and announced they had called the county zoning office earlier that day, who confirmed the field was not under HOA jurisdiction. This revelation sent waves of murmurs across the room. The HOA credibility, built on years of intimidation and selective enforcement, was crumbling. But pride can be a dangerous motivator, and instead of admitting wrongdoing, the board doubled down. They proposed a new bylaw amendment, one granting the HOA authority over all land visible from community areas. It was an outrageous overreach, legally meaningless, and blatantly crafted to retroactively justify their actions. The room erupted in disbelief. Homeowners demanded to know why the board was trying to expand its power after being caught abusing it. A heated argument broke out near the front row, two neighbors clashing verbally about the board's history of overreach. Someone shouted that the HOA president needed to resign. Someone else shouted back about neighborhood standards. Chairs scraped across the floor as people stood, gesturing angrily, and the meeting spiraled beyond anyone's control. Eventually, a board member attempted to restore order by threatening to end the meeting, but the damage was already done. The unity of the HOA board was visibly crumbling. Even some of the board members appeared uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the crowd, clearly realizing they had been dragged into a leadership disaster. Meanwhile, the landowner remained at home, listening to the distant murmur of raised voices carried faintly across the field. They knew the HOA desperation meant the trouble wasn't over. Desperate organizations made reckless decisions. Reckless decisions led to bigger consequences, and consequences had a habit of slamming into people who least expected them. Later that night, long after the meeting dissolved into chaos and residents returned home still heated from the confrontation, an email from the HOA landed in inboxes across the community. It was long, stiffly worded, and filled with damage, control language about miscommunication, community standards, and pending legal clarification. But buried in the message was something startling, an announcement that the HOA had retained legal counsel to pursue resolution regarding unauthorized livestock adjacent to the subdivision. It was a thinly veiled threat. The landowner read the email twice, stunned not by the aggression but by the stupidity. The HOA had already been warned by the sheriff. They had already embarrassed themselves publicly, yet now they wanted to escalate, using homeowners' dues to pursue a legal battle they could never win. The next morning, the landowner received a letter not from the HOA, but from an attorney representing them. The letter accused the landowner of maintaining livestock in violation of community sightline expectations, obstructing neighborhood views, lowering property values, and causing emotional distress to residents. It demanded the horses be removed or relocated to ensure visual compliance with community standards. It was laughable. It was enraging, and it was legally meaningless, but the letter served a different purpose. It revealed the HOA mindset. They were backed into a corner, and instead of accepting responsibility, they intended to fight. They believed they could intimidate their way out of consequences. They believed a lawsuit threat would weaken the landowner. They believed they could rewrite the law by rewriting the narrative, but they were wrong. The landowner immediately forwarded the letter to the sheriff's office and the county attorney's office, attaching video evidence and an incident report number. They also contacted their own attorney, who reviewed the HOA claims with increasing disbelief before outlining a plan that would turn the HOA threats into a legal trap. The landowner didn't want revenge. They wanted the harassment to stop, but the HOA had crossed a line so severe, so reckless, that simple de-escalation was no longer realistic. They had attempted an illegal livestock seizure. They had misused community funds. They had lied publicly. They had doubled down on false claims. They had threatened legal action built on fabricated authority. And now, the county was watching them. The sheriff had documented everything. And the community, once apathetic, was beginning to mobilize. The HOA didn't know it yet, but their unraveling had only just begun. The following days unfolded with the slow, deliberate inevitability of a storm front rolling across open plains, building force long before the first strike of lightning. The HOA attempt to regain control of the narrative had already begun to crumble under community backlash. But the situation shifted dramatically when the county offices took notice. The sheriff's incident report had been filed with clear language: attempted unlawful seizure of livestock, misuse of HOA representation, and potential fraud in commissioning a towing company under false authority. These were not minor infractions. These were actions that forced government departments to take a closer look. And when the county attorney's office opened the case file, the absurdity of the HOA behavior moved from community gossip to official scrutiny. The landowner learned of this development not from the HOA, but from a polite voicemail left by a county investigator who wanted to schedule a call. The message was calm, measured, and vaguely apologetic, as if the county already understood they were stepping into a mess created by a group of overzealous volunteers who didn't grasp the consequences of impersonating authority. When the landowner returned the call, the investigator listened patiently, asking for more documentation, requesting copies of the HOA threatening attorney letter, and even asking whether the towing company had provided a statement. Every detail strengthened the case. The more the investigator heard, the more incredulous their tone became. They pointed out that any HOA attempting to regulate private agricultural land was violating both county zoning laws and state statutes that protected livestock owners from nuisance claims based on visibility alone. The field, with its horses grazing peacefully, was legally untouchable unless there was evidence of abuse or harm, which the sheriff had already ruled out days earlier. As the investigation expanded, the HOA continued spiraling deeper into self-inflicted chaos. Their attorney, either misinformed or misled by the board, doubled down with a second letter demanding immediate compliance with community visibility standards, and insisting the HOA possessed external easement influence. The phrase held no meaning. It was a legal fiction, crafted by someone who either misunderstood property law entirely or hoped that sounding authoritative would be enough to intimidate. The landowner forwarded the letter to the county investigator, who responded almost immediately, asking permission to subpoena the HOA for financial records related to the towing company's payment. That single request marked the moment the HOA situation shifted from embarrassing to catastrophic. Meanwhile, the community itself was beginning to fracture under the weight of the scandal. Neighbors who had once ignored HOA politics now found themselves arguing on sidewalks, in driveways, at the local coffee shop. Some were furious that their dues had been used for an unauthorized towing operation. Others defended the board out of habit, insisting the landowner was difficult or uncooperative, though they had no evidence to support the claim. Some residents grew quiet, ashamed of having trusted an organization now revealed to be reckless, arrogant, and dangerously ignorant of the law. A few even reached out privately to the landowner, apologizing for the actions of the board and offering support. These messages were unexpected but appreciated, a reminder that not everyone in the subdivision had been swept up in the HOA self-righteous theatrics. The HOA president, sensing her authority slipping, responded to growing criticism by issuing yet another community-wide email. This one was longer, more frantic, and noticeably defensive. She claimed the board acted under urgent safety concerns, that the sheriff's involvement had been misinterpreted, and that the HOA was now facing unfair accusations based on partial information. The email ended with a threat that any resident spreading misinformation could face HOA disciplinary action. If the goal was to silence dissent, it failed spectacularly. The community exploded with outrage. Residents dug into the bylaws, pointing out that the HOA never had authority to discipline anyone for discussing board actions. Others demanded a recall vote. A few declared openly that they refused to pay dues until the board provided transparency. Screenshots circulated faster than the HOA could respond, and for the first time in years, the board found itself under attack not from a single homeowner, but from the very residents it claimed to protect. Instead of calming the situation, the HOA president made a monumental mistake. she sent a cease and desist letter to one of the community's most outspoken critics, a retired judge who had lived in the subdivision for over a decade and had no patience for authoritarian antics. The judge, amused rather than intimidated, posted the letter publicly and responded with his own statement, calmly outlining every legal violation the HOA had committed. He concluded by stating he was considering filing an injunction to prevent the HOA from conducting further rogue operations. The board's credibility collapsed further when a recording from the chaotic emergency meeting leaked. The audio captured homeowners shouting questions, the HOA president dodging responsibility, the board scrambling to justify their actions, and the moment someone demanded a full financial audit. The recording spread like wildfire. By now, the landowner didn't need to involve themselves. The community was dismantling the HOA from within. But the unraveling accelerated when the county investigator requested a formal interview with the Lavestock Towing Company. The crew, eager to clear their name, provided a detailed statement explaining how the HOA misrepresented their authority, claiming they had full jurisdiction over the field. They handed over the work order, emails, and even the board member's handwritten note that read, "Animals must be removed to comply with HOA standards." It was the final nail in the board's coffin. The county's legal team reviewed the documents, and the investigator informed the landowner that the HOA might face charges for fraudulently commissioning services under false authority and attempting to seize property illegally. The possibility of criminal charges against individual board members became increasingly real. Word of this leaked within days, sending the HOA board into a panic. The president called another emergency meeting, but attendance was minimal this time. Residents had grown tired of excuses and half-truths. Those who did attend recorded everything. The president blamed the towing company, then the sheriff, then miscommunication, then aggressive homeowners, never once acknowledging the board's own incompetence or illegal actions. Several board members looked visibly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact, whispering among themselves, realizing they were tied to a sinking ship. By the end of the meeting, 2 board members resigned on the spot. Their resignation emails circulated the next morning, both expressing regret and disclaiming involvement in the towing decision. With the board fracturing, the HOA president became more desperate. She sent a final, frantic, poorly structured email accusing the landowner of creating unneeded drama, claiming the board had acted out of community necessity, and threatening further legal action if the situation continued to escalate. But the threat rang hollow. County had already escalated the matter far beyond HOA jurisdiction, and the sheriff's office, observing the HOA erratic behavior, had flagged them for potential civil violations and recommended they cease all contact with the landowner. The HOA president's grip on authority broke completely when the county investigator announced that the HOA was under a formal review. A community-wide notice confirmed the investigation, and residents reacted with shock, anger, and a sense of grim satisfaction. Some whispered about the possibility of dissolving the HOA entirely. Others discussed the election of a new board, but all of them, regardless of their stance, recognized the truth. Their HOA had crossed a line so severe that recovery was doubtful. Meanwhile, the landowner returned to the field each day, continuing their routine while the world around them spiraled into chaos. The horses, unaffected by human drama, grazed peacefully beneath the shifting sky, flicking their tails and watching the horizon as if sensing change in the wind. The landowner knew the worst was nearly over, but another battle was approaching. One not with the HOA but with the fallout of their failure, because investigations had consequences, charges had consequences, and community backlash had consequences. The HOA had set events in motion that could not be undone, and as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting long shadows across the field, the landowner realized the next chapter would determine the future of the entire subdivision, perhaps even the survival of the HOA itself. The morning after the sheriff's intervention settled over the valley like an uneasy calm, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the stretched silence of a storm gathering strength somewhere just out of sight. The fields stood damp from a late night drizzle, and the horses moved slowly along the fence line, their bodies glistening beneath the pale blue light. Yet even their presence, normally a source of grounding and normalcy, felt overshadowed by the memory of metal ramps, idling engines, and the collective tension of people who had been seconds away from committing a crime under the guise of authority. The homeowner found themselves moving through the house with a heightened awareness, every routine action punctuated by flashes of the previous afternoon. But the HOA, instead of retreating after being caught, seemed to internalize the humiliation and transform it into something colder, more vindictive, as though the thwarted attempt had awakened within them a desire not just to assert control, but to punish for the embarrassment they had suffered. It began subtly at first, with signs that could almost be ignored. Neighbors clustering at the end of the main cul-de-sac, their voices dropping to hushed tones whenever the homeowner passed near. Cars slowing in front of the property longer than usual. A series of anonymous complaints filed to the county about noise disturbances, late-night activity, and improper waste disposal, all of which were dismissed immediately but nonetheless signaled a new, targeted hostility. The psychological warfare that followed was quiet, constant, and precision-cut. The HOA president in particular seemed to move with renewed aggression, appearing in places she never used to frequent. The gravel road near the barn, the far end of the boundary fence, the edge of the property where the fields met the HOA, managed walking trail. Each presence meant not to communicate but to loom. She documented everything she could point her phone at: manure piles, feed barrels, hoof prints near the trail, the horses themselves grazing peacefully like symbols of defiance. The homeowner began to sense that the HOA had shifted strategies, moving away from brute enforcement efforts toward assembling a case built from technicalities, loopholes, and interpretations stretched so thin they barely resembled rules at all. And soon, evidence of this approach surfaced in the form of a thick envelope taped to the gate, the HOA logo stamped in aggressive ink. Inside was a notice of violation escalation, a document so long that it seemed intentionally designed to overwhelm the average person with sheer volume. It claimed that the horses posed safety issues for the community, that the flies they attracted were a biohazard, that grazing animals near community walking paths created risk of injury to pedestrians, that animal waste runoff could contaminate shared drainage lines, and even that the presence of livestock diminished the uniform visual character of the neighborhood. Each accusation was framed as a potential breach of some subsection of the HOA guidelines, twisted creatively into applications they were never meant for. The homeowner felt a slow burn rise inside their chest while reading, not just from anger but from the sheer audacity of a group that refused to accept boundaries even after being called out by law enforcement. What struck them most was a line near the bottom, typed in smaller print as though hoping the eye would slide past it, an announcement of an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for that weekend to vote on immediate corrective actions regarding the livestock situation. The notice claimed the HOA had legal grounds to take further steps to enforce compliance, wording vague enough to conceal meaning yet forceful enough to imply serious intent. It felt like the overture to something bigger, a build-up to a confrontation they were carefully crafting behind closed doors. Over the next 2 days, the homeowner documented everything: the fence lines, the pasture, the horses' condition, the natural drainage paths, the walking trail, and every point at which the HOA arguments could be disproven through photographs and time-stamped videos. They contacted the county agricultural office again, this time gathering formal written statements clarifying the land's zoning and the legality of maintaining horses on the property. They assembled emails, permits, registration documents, and maps into a single file so thick it would be impossible for anyone to ignore. Yet even with all of this, the tension didn't ease. If anything, preparation only sharpened the sense of anticipation, the awareness that a conflict was approaching fast, and that the HOA was not simply seeking compliance. They were seeking control, and control was something they would not gain so easily. On the morning of the emergency meeting, the neighborhood filled with cars earlier than usual, a slow parade of residents moving toward the clubhouse with eager, almost performative energy. Groups clustered near the entrance, whispering, pointing toward the homeowner's property, their expressions carrying a mixture of curiosity, annoyance, and opportunistic satisfaction. It was clear that the HOA had been spreading its own narrative in the days following their failed towing attempt, painting the situation as one in which they were protectors of community order battling against an obstinate rule breaker. The homeowner walked toward the meeting with a steady gait, their folder tucked under one arm, their breath measured. The atmosphere inside felt charged, as though the air itself hummed with judgment. The HOA board sat in a rigid line at the front table, their faces arranged into masks of professionalism, though the tightness around their mouths betrayed the animosity beneath. The president opened the meeting with a tone that attempted to convey both civility and stern authority, presenting the situation as though the HOA were simply following protocol, ignoring the fact that their last attempt had resulted in the sheriff threatening to arrest them. She introduced a series of complaints, each one read aloud in a way that exaggerated their seriousness. Fly concerns became environmental hazards, horse neighing became persistent disruptive noise. Hoofprints near the trail became evidence of encroachment onto shared property. But the homeowner remained silent, allowing her to finish her long performance before stepping forward. The moment they began laying out the facts, the shift in the room became palpable. They presented photographs disproving the claims, zoning documents confirming the horse's legality, written statements from county officials rejecting the HOA authority over livestock property, and time-stamped footage of the HOA president trespassing repeatedly to film the pasture. Murmurs spread through the residents as the narrative they had been fed began to crumble. The president's expression tightened, but before she could regain footing, the homeowner revealed one final piece of evidence. The sheriff's official incident report stating that the HOA had unlawfully attempted to seize privately owned livestock without proper authority. The room fell silent, not from shock alone, but from the weight of undeniable truth. It was a moment in which the HOA entire posture collapsed under its own falsehoods. Yet despite this, the president attempted to salvage control, insisting that the board still had the right to vote on sanctions. But the atmosphere had shifted. Several residents stood, voicing objections, questioning the legality of the meeting itself, demanding accountability for the attempted seizure of the horses. The board, clearly fracturing under scrutiny, attempted to regain order, but the meeting quickly unraveled into confusion and dissent. The homeowner watched the disarray unfold with a sense of surreal detachment, realizing that the HOA had lost more than just the argument. They had lost credibility. Eventually, the meeting adjourned in chaos with no vote, no sanctions, and no unified stance. The HOA leaders exited in a huddle, their expressions dark and simmering, leaving the homeowner with a sense of partial victory, but also the unmistakable awareness that this battle was far from over. And as they stepped back into the cool afternoon air, the sky thick with low clouds, they sensed that the HOA next move would not be procedural or public. It would be retaliatory, calculated, and carried out in the shadows of their bruised authority. The stage was set for something deeper and more dangerous, and the homeowner felt the weight of an approaching clash that would force both sides into a confrontation neither could avoid. The storm had not passed, it had only gathered strength, waiting for the moment to break. The days following the chaotic HOA meeting unfolded with an unsettling quiet, a silence that pressed down on the homeowner like a heavy fog that refused to lift, dense enough to obscure what moved beneath it, but never dense enough to offer comfort. It was the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel amplified, every distant car door, every rustle of wind through the pasture grass, every creak of the barn would echo with an undercurrent of tension, as though the land itself was bracing for something it could sense approaching long before human intuition could grasp it. The horses sensed it too, acting differently than usual. They stayed close together, their movements slower, their ears pricking at noises they normally ignored. Their unease only deepened the homeowner's own instinctive awareness that the HOA, humiliated and fractured but still driven by a stubborn hunger for control, was regrouping and recalibrating its efforts behind the scenes. Retaliation, after all, rarely arrives in obvious form when egos have been bruised this deeply. It arrives in shadows, in paperwork, in tactics that operate just inside the boundaries of legality while exploiting every gray area to its fullest. The homeowner began to notice subtle but deliberate changes in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Cars they didn't recognize passed by their property more frequently, lingering for a few seconds too long before continuing on. Residents who had previously kept their distance now seemed to move with a watchful, almost investigative curiosity, appearing near the fence line under the pretense of jogging walking dogs, or strolling with coffee cups in hand, always careful to mask their intentions with casual postures even though their eyes scanned the property with a level of scrutiny that betrayed the HOA influence. It wasn't long before a new envelope appeared in the mailbox, thicker than usual and marked with formal county stationery, a packet containing a scheduled inspection request prompted by an anonymous tip, alleging sanitation violations related to the livestock. The timing was too perfect, too coordinated, and though the homeowner's documentation was thorough enough to withstand any examination, the implication was clear. The HOA had shifted its retaliation strategy toward weaponizing external agencies, hoping to bury the homeowner under enough bureaucratic scrutiny that something, somewhere, would stick. Before the homeowner could fully process the inspection notice, another arrived the next morning. This one from the Environmental Compliance Division, citing a concern about potential contamination of a seasonal drainage area located near the property line. The accusation was absurd given the slope of the land and the well-maintained pasture, but reason had no place in the HOA campaign now. Their strategy was to trigger a chain reaction of official involvement until sheer volume became overwhelming. The homeowner spent hours gathering not just documentation but evidence of the HOA trespassing, harassment, and previous illegal towing attempt, preparing for the possibility that the retaliation might escalate into something even the county would need to be made aware of. Yet even with all this preparation, a sense of unease persisted, because paperwork was only one weapon the HOA had historically relied on. The more dangerous weapon, the one they deployed when frustrated or cornered, was manipulation of perception, creating enough noise that truth became lost beneath layers of exaggeration and rumor, and soon enough that weapon surfaced too. Whispered misinformation began weaving through the neighborhood like smoke from a slow, burning fire, claims that the horses were aggressive, that they had broken through the fence before, that they posed a danger to children walking along the community trail. None of it was true, but truth was irrelevant in the court of public opinion when fear could be shaped into something useful for control. The HOA president, although publicly humiliated after the sheriff incident, appeared more energized than ever in her covert campaign. She orchestrated small gatherings among board loyalists, positioning herself as the tireless defender of the community, spinning the narrative that she was merely trying to protect homeowners from a growing livestock threat. It was a calculated manipulation designed to regain support, and slowly, it began to work on some residents who were eager for any explanation that allowed them to place blame on someone else rather than confront the dysfunction within their own HOA leadership. Yet the homeowner remained outwardly calm, refusing to give the HOA the emotional reaction they craved. Instead, they documented every new development, saving screenshots of misleading social media posts circulating within neighborhood groups, photos of unrecognized cars pulling up to the property line at odd hours, and notes about each county notice that arrived. They prepared for the upcoming inspections meticulously, knowing that transparency and factual accuracy were their strongest defenses. Still, the psychological toll grew heavier each day. What once felt like a home now felt like contested territory, as though simply existing on their own land had become a statement of defiance that the HOA resented with increasing intensity. As the inspection dates approached, the homeowner noticed something that struck them as particularly unusual. The HOA president had stopped appearing near the property altogether. Her absence seemed too abrupt, too artificial, as though she was deliberately avoiding being seen, which only fueled speculation about what new scheme she might be crafting. The homeowner's suspicions were confirmed one night when they noticed faint beams of flashing light moving through the pasture, small and quick like reflections from a phone or flashlight. When they stepped onto the porch, the lights vanished, but not before the homeowner saw a shadowy figure retreat toward the community trail. It was then they realized the HOA had shifted from public retaliation to covert attempts at gathering incriminating evidence, likely trying to fabricate a scenario they could later present to county officials. The following morning, tire tracks appeared near the edge of the pasture, leading toward the trail access point. Someone had been attempting to enter the property at night. Rather than panic, the homeowner installed additional trail cameras, hidden, motion-activated cameras placed along every vulnerable corner of the boundary line. If the HOA was trying to create a false narrative, they would be caught in the act. Meanwhile, the horses continued to display signs of distress, pacing more than usual and staying close to the barn door at night. Their instincts sensed what the homeowner already knew. The land was being watched, stalked even, by people who believed they were above consequences. When the first county inspector arrived, expecting to find a neglected, contaminated pasture based on the anonymous complaints, he instead found well-kept land, clean water sources, and documented evidence of responsible livestock ownership. His demeanor shifted from formal detachment to mild annoyance, clearly recognizing that he had been misled. The homeowner provided the full documentation packet, including zoning laws confirming the property's agricultural rights, and the inspector left satisfied, promising to file a report clearing the property of all allegations. But one inspection wouldn't quell the HOA obsession. The environmental compliance officer arrived 2 days later and came to a similar conclusion. The land was in proper condition and posed no contamination risk. Still, the homeowner could sense that the HOA wasn't finished. Bureaucratic harassment was only phase 1 of their retaliation. Phase 2 would involve escalation, and that escalation arrived in the form of a certified letter marked "Legal Review Pending," stating that the HOA was considering legal action to compel compliance with community standards. It was an intimidation tactic, bold but hollow, yet it signaled that the board had no intention of letting the situation fade. But the homeowner had something the HOA didn't know about yet: camera footage. When the trail cameras were checked later that week, the footage revealed several shocking discoveries: multiple board members trespassing near the pasture late at night, the HOA president herself attempting to measure distances along the fence line with a tape measure, and at least one individual trying to loosen a section of fencing as though attempting to create a scenario where a horse might wander onto the trail. It was evidence not just of harassment, but of attempted sabotage. Holding the footage, the homeowner felt a slow, steady resolve settle inside them, stronger than fear and steadier than anger. The HOA had crossed from retaliation into criminal behavior, and the homeowner now held proof. The next step was inevitable, and it would change everything. As evening settled over the valley with a heavy, expectant stillness, the homeowner knew what they had to do next, and whom they needed to call. The storm the HOA had been stirring was finally about to break, and this time it would not break over the property owner's life. It would break over the HOA itself. The decision to involve law enforcement again did not come lightly, yet as the homeowner stood on the porch that night with the trail, camera footage glowing on the screen of their phone, there was no longer room for hesitation. The situation had escalated past petty HOA harassment into deliberate, coordinated acts of sabotage that threatened not only the horses but the safety and integrity of the property itself. The air was thick and unmoving, carrying the scent of damp earth and the quiet tension of a night holding its breath. Stars hung low and pale in a sky muted by thin clouds, and the only sound came from the horses shifting inside the barn, their hooves brushing the straw in restless patterns. It felt as though the entire world had gone still in anticipation of the next inevitable move. When the homeowner finally placed the call, their voice was steady, their explanation crisp, the kind of clarity that forms when fear and anger have condensed into a solid, unwavering purpose. The sheriff's office responded with professionalism, requesting copies of the footage, the timestamps, and any additional documentation related to previous HOA incidents. The homeowner compiled everything into a single digital folder: the attempted towing operation, the trespassing, the fabricated complaints, the late-night prowlers near the fence line, and the unmistakable image of the HOA president attempting to loosen the wires on the pasture gate. The deputy who reviewed the footage called back within an hour, his tone firm and unmistakably serious as he confirmed that this was no longer a civil dispute. It was now a criminal matter involving trespassing, attempted property damage, and reckless endangerment of livestock. He assured the homeowner that the sheriff himself would be briefed by morning. As dawn broke over the valley, the homeowner felt an unusual mix of relief and dread. The land glowed with early sunlight that cast long shadows across the pasture, each beam of gold slicing through the dew. Covered grass like a reminder that truth thrives in the light, even when others try to bury it in darkness. The horses emerged from the barn slowly, their breathing calm but their movements guarded, as though they too sensed that the previous night had marked a turning point. By mid-morning, a white sheriff's SUV rolled up the gravel driveway with a deliberate, unhurried authority. The sheriff stepped out with a presence that commanded attention, not through theatrics but through a grounded confidence honed over years of experience dealing with disputes far more tangled than simple neighborhood disagreements. He greeted the homeowner with a nod and requested to see the full footage firsthand. As he watched, his expression grew increasingly stern. He paused the video at key moments, at the sight of the HOA president stretching the tape measure across the fence in the dead of night, at the moment when another figure tried pulling at the fence ties, at the clear image of a board member crouched in the shadows with a phone pointed at the pasture. The sheriff said nothing for a long moment after finishing the footage, and then he made a sequence of calls, his voice controlled but carrying a firm undertone that suggested he was assembling something more serious than a routine response. Within the hour, 2 additional sheriff's vehicles arrived, followed by a county investigator who specialized in property and agricultural cases. The HOA had intended to quietly erode the homeowner's stability through covert pressure, but instead, they had triggered the involvement of multiple agencies now examining their pattern of behavior with legal precision. The investigator walked the perimeter of the pasture with the homeowner, reviewing the areas where trespassers had stepped, measuring footprints in the soil, and confirming that the tampering at the fence had been deliberate rather than accidental. Findings strengthened the case even further. Meanwhile, the sheriff explained that trespassing with the intent to release livestock could result in charges of endangerment, criminal mischief, and potentially conspiracy, depending on how many participants were involved. He requested the names of all HOA board members and advised the homeowner to prepare for formal statements. By afternoon, news of law enforcement's presence at the property had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Curtains twitched, cars slowed as they passed, residents exchanged hurried whispers in driveways, their curiosity intermingled with the first hints of fear that the HOA narrative was falling apart, fear that the people they had supported or tolerated might have crossed irreversible lines. What the HOA had planned as silent retaliation had now burst into the open, exposed under the harsh scrutiny of legal consequence. The HOA president, who had been conspicuously absent from public view since the sabotage attempt, finally emerged when she realized sheriff's vehicles were parked near the trail entrance. She approached with stiff, forced composure, carrying a thin folder of her own as though attempting to maintain the illusion of authority. But when the sheriff confronted her with the footage, her facade cracked in visible waves, first disbelief, then panic, then the frantic scrambling of someone attempting to reinterpret reality to avoid accountability. She claimed the videos were taken out of context, that she was checking property boundaries for trail safety concerns, that the others were simply performing community inspections. But the sheriff was unmoved. His tone remained neutral yet unyielding as he explained that nighttime trespassing on privately owned agricultural land was not a community inspection but a criminal act. The HOA president's face drained of color as he informed her that she and several board members would be required to appear for formal questioning. Her attempt to argue dissolved into stammered half, sentences that carried none of the confidence she wielded during HOA meetings. The sheriff ended the exchange with a curt reminder that interfering with livestock was a serious offense, and that this investigation was now officially underway. As the day progressed, tension in the neighborhood reached a new peak. Some residents cautiously approached the homeowner later, their tones apologetic as they confessed that they had believed the HOA earlier claims without realizing how much manipulation had been at play. Others avoided eye contact entirely, unsure of where loyalty should lie now that consequences loomed. The HOA board, once unified in their mission of control, now appeared fractured. Some members went silent, while others whispered frantically as they tried to assess the legal fallout. That night, the homeowner sat at their kitchen table reviewing documents while the horses slept peacefully in the barn, unaware of the wildfire they had been used to ignite. For the first time in weeks, the homeowner felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Hope that the HOA ability to terrorize them was finally unraveling. Hope that accountability was catching up to people who had long operated without fear of consequence. But even this hope carried a shadow, because they knew the HOA president was not the type to surrender quietly. She was someone who clung to control the way a drowning swimmer clings to the last gasp of air. And people like her did not simply resign themselves to defeat. They scrambled, clawed, and sabotaged until the last possible moment. And that moment came sooner than expected. The following morning, as the homeowner walked along the fence line checking for any new signs of tampering, they noticed a small drone hovering just above the treetops. Its silent rotors blended with the sound of the wind, but its movement was purposeful, circling slowly as though scanning the property. The homeowner watched with growing disbelief. The HOA president had escalated again, not in secrecy this time, but in broad daylight, using a drone to record the property despite the sheriff's warnings. It was both brazen and desperate, a final act of defiance that showed she felt the walls closing in and was trying to claw back control through any means left. The homeowner filmed the drone, capturing clear footage of its flight path, knowing this would only strengthen the charges against her. When the drone finally retreated toward the neighborhood, the homeowner made another call to the sheriff, their voice steady but resolute. The retaliation had escalated too far. The investigation was deepening. And now, with every new misstep, the HOA president was building the case against herself piece by piece. As the sun began to set that evening, the sky burned with streaks of orange and red that reflected off the pasture like embers of an approaching fire. The horses grazed calmly, unaware of the storm brewing between humans who failed to understand boundaries. The homeowner stood at the edge of the field, breathing in the scent of hay and warm earth, knowing that the inevitable confrontation, final, decisive, and unstoppable, was drawing closer with every passing moment. The HOA had tried intimidation, sabotage, misinformation, and now surveillance. They had played every card in their arsenal, but soon the sheriff would play his. And when he did, the HOA reign of unchecked power would finally face consequences it could no longer outrun. The final escalation began not with dramatic sirens or shouting, but with an early morning stillness so sharp that it felt like the whole valley was holding its breath, waiting for something long overdue to unfold. The homeowner stepped onto the porch just as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, painting the pasture in muted shades of gray, blue as the horses stirred inside the barn. Quiet was different this time, heavier, denser, tinged with a sense of inevitability that came from knowing the sheriff had confirmed the previous night that formal action would be taken today. There was no longer any doubt, no lingering fear of the HOA slipping away from accountability. The investigation had grown too large, too detailed, too damning for even their most manipulative tactics to escape. Trespassing footage, attempted sabotage, fabricated complaints, drone surveillance. Each piece formed a mosaic of misconduct that even the most HOA-loyal county officials couldn't ignore. The homeowner watched the gravel road leading to the property, feeling the weight of weeks of stress settle into something steadier, something grounded, the knowledge that justice was finally moving in their direction. The horses, sensing the shift in the air, moved calmly to the fence line as though drawn by the same anticipation that spread through the land itself. And then, just as the sun crested over the ridge, the sheriff's convoy arrived. 3 vehicles, lights off but presence unmistakable, rolled down the road with controlled, deliberate authority. The sheriff stepped out first, his expression measured but carrying the unmistakable resolve of someone who had completed his investigation and was now ready to act. Behind him, 2 deputies and the county investigator emerged. each reviewing notes and prepared documents. The homeowner approached, tension and relief colliding inside them, as the sheriff nodded and explained that today they would be issuing citations, seizing evidence, and delivering formal notices to the HOA board regarding criminal charges. Despite knowing this moment was coming, hearing it spoken so plainly felt surreal, like the closing chapter of a nightmare finally being written by someone who understood the full scope of what had happened. The sheriff requested the homeowner accompany them to the community trail entrance, where they planned to confront the HOA president and any involved board members directly. The walk felt strangely symbolic, each step along the fence line carrying echoes of every night the HOA had trespassed, every scheme they had attempted, every moment the homeowner had felt watched or threatened. The horses followed the movement with calm curiosity from the pasture, unaware that this morning marked the end of the conflict that had disturbed their peaceful routine for so long. As the sheriff's group reached the trail entrance, a small crowd had already gathered, residents drawn by the sight of official vehicles, board members trying to maintain composure, and neighbors who had been quietly observing the escalating drama with growing concern. The HOA president emerged last, clutching a binder stuffed with printed screenshots, maps, and justification letters, her expression a strained mixture of resentment and fear. She attempted to greet the sheriff with feigned authority, but the sheriff cut through her posturing with the calm precision of someone who had endured enough. He handed her a packet of legal documents, citations for trespassing, notices of investigation for attempted property damage, and an official warning regarding misuse of HOA authority. Her face drained of color as she flipped through the pages. The binder she held, the one she had prepared as her defense, suddenly looked flimsy and absurd compared to the sheriff's thick packet of evidence against her. When she tried to speak, her words stumbled out as disjointed excuses about community standards and protecting residents. But the sheriff interrupted with firm clarity, explaining that nighttime trespassing, fence tampering, and unauthorized drone surveillance were criminal actions, not community enforcement. Her attempts to redirect accountability toward other board members faltered quickly, especially when the sheriff noted that multiple individuals were identifiable in the trail, camera footage, and would be required to attend an investigative hearing with the county prosecutor. The crowd behind her shifted uneasily. Some HOA members slipped away quietly, distancing themselves from her unraveling facade. Others stood rigid, realizing their participation, or silent complicity, was now under direct scrutiny. The HOA president, cornered at last, attempted one final tactic, claiming the homeowner was the true aggressor, accusing them of weaponizing the sheriff's office to intimidate the community. But the sheriff responded with a calm finality that silenced even the murmurs among the residents. The homeowner had done nothing wrong, nothing illegal, nothing outside their rights as the owner of privately owned agricultural land. The only ones who had escalated matters were the very people now standing before him, clutching their binder of fabricated grievances while facing the consequences of their own actions. As the confrontation unfolded, the homeowner watched quietly, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. There was no triumph in watching neighbors face legal repercussions, no satisfaction in seeing an entire board exposed for misconduct. There was only relief that the nightmare was finally unwinding. The sheriff completed the notices, recorded statements from residents who had witnessed suspicious late-night activity, and informed the HOA board that any further retaliation would result in additional charges. He emphasized that the HOA had no authority beyond the boundaries of the subdivision, and that attempting to seize livestock again would result in immediate arrest. The HOA president, trembling with frustration she could no longer hide, retreated behind the remaining board members as the sheriff concluded his briefing. For the first time since the conflict began, the homeowners watching from nearby yards looked not to the HOA board for leadership, but to the sheriff, seeking truth rather than control. As the sheriff turned back toward the homeowner to confirm that the next steps would follow in writing, the homeowner felt a weight lift from their chest, a slow unfurling of tension that had been knotted tight for far too long. The investigation would continue, but the threat had been neutralized. The HOA no longer had the freedom to operate in the shadows. Later that day, after the sheriff's convoy departed, the homeowner walked the perimeter of the pasture, checking the fence line out of habit. The horses grazed peacefully, unconcerned by the human drama that had erupted beyond their understanding. Sunlight poured over the valley in warm, forgiving waves, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like the land could breathe again. Neighbors approached cautiously throughout the afternoon, some offering apologies, others expressing shock at the depth of the HOA misconduct. The homeowner listened politely, but made no effort to fuel gossip. Their priority was restoring peace, not public humiliation. Word spread quickly that emergency HOA elections would be held, that resignations were imminent, that changes were being demanded from all sides. By evening, the HOA president and 2 board members had stepped down. The homeowner watched the sun set behind the ridge, feeling a sense of closure settle across the land like a soft blanket. The birds returned to their usual chorus. The horses nickered gently as they gathered near the barn. The quiet that descended over the property no longer carried tension. It carried relief. The field, once the center of a storm, had reclaimed its tranquility. In the fading light, the homeowner realized something profound. The HOA had tried to control land that wasn't theirs, animals they didn't own, and a family they had no authority over. But in their arrogance, they had only exposed their own corruption and strengthened the homeowner's resolve to protect what mattered. The sheriff had arrived before they could load the horses. Justice had arrived before the HOA could rewrite the truth. And now at last the land could rest, the horses could rest, and so could the homeowner, knowing the storm was finally over and peace, long fought for, had finally returned to the field that had always been theirs.